You don't need friends after 60, the Buddhist wisdom on letting go and finding inner peace. Do you really need friends after 60? For many, friendship is sacred. It brings joy, connection, support. And at first glance, the idea of not needing friends may seem cold, even unthinkable. But what if, just what if, as we grow older, the nature of our relationships is meant to shift? What if the peace you seek in others can only be found in solitude? What if letting go of certain friendships isn't a sign of loss, but a sign of wisdom? Welcome to Lotus of Dharma, a space where we explore Buddhist teachings, mindful living, and the quiet path back to inner peace. In this video, we'll explore this idea not from a place of cynicism, but through the gentle clarity of Buddhist insight. Together, we'll reflect on what it means to outgrow the need for constant connection, and how stillness can become our most faithful companion in the later chapters of life. Before we begin, if this message already resonates with something inside you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content for those walking the quiet path of inner growth. Now, take a deep breath. Let the noise of the world soften. And join me as we step into a new understanding of friendship, one that begins not with others, but with the self. You no longer need to prove yourself to anyone. In the early chapters of our lives, we are taught to strive. From childhood, we are praised for achievement, not presence. We are conditioned to believe that our worth must be earned, by pleasing others, by excelling, by becoming somebody in the eyes of the world. This conditioning becomes the soil in which our self-worth grows, fragile and dependent on others. We want others to see us as competent, beautiful, kind, successful. We want to hear "well done," to be invited, included, validated. We build friendships not always out of genuine connection, but sometimes as a way to anchor our sense of self. But what happens when we reach the latter part of our lives, perhaps after 60, and we begin to look inward instead of outward? The answer is simple and liberating. We no longer need an audience. We no longer need a stage. We no longer need to prove that we matter, because we finally understand that we always have. The Buddha once said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." To truly absorb this teaching is to be free from the exhausting need to impress. Imagine a candle. Its flame does not burn brighter because others look at it. It simply burns, quietly, steadily, without fanfare. This is what spiritual maturity offers, a return to essence. The trap of identity. When we are young, we become entangled in roles: the successful one, the helpful one, the admired one. We wear these roles like robes, each one stitched with the threads of expectation. But robes, no matter how beautiful, are still garments. And we are not the garments we wear. After 60, many begin to ask a sacred question: who am I when no one is watching? If the answer is unclear, then perhaps we have spent too much time performing, and not enough time being. This is the time to let go, not of people, but of the performance. Not of love, but of the need to be loved in a particular way. There is a story in Buddhist folklore of an old tree in the forest. When it was young, it reached toward the sky, desperate to grow taller than the others, to be seen, to be admired. Birds came, rested on its branches, then flew away. The tree felt useful only when it was full of life and movement. But as years passed, the tree stopped stretching. It began simply to be. It let its branches grow in their own direction. It welcomed the seasons, sun, wind, snow, rain, with quiet grace. One day, a traveler sat under it, finding shade and stillness. The tree did nothing to earn this moment. Its presence was enough. We too must become like that tree. You don't need to prove your intelligence with clever words. You don't need to prove your kindness by always saying yes. You don't need to prove your value by the number of friends who remember your birthday. At 60 and beyond, your life has already spoken. The story has already been written in the lines of your face, in the laughter you've shared, in the tears you've dried, in the love you've given, even if unnoticed. The final chapter of your life is not a test to pass. It is a sanctuary to enter. And in that sanctuary, there is no audience. Just you, your breath, your memories, your silence, and the gentle truth that you are enough. The Buddha did not seek praise. He did not adjust his teaching for popularity. He walked a lonely path, not because he was unloved, but because he had become love itself. He did not need to be accepted, because he had accepted all things. When you no longer need to prove yourself, you begin to live differently. You speak less, but with more truth. You choose solitude, but never feel alone. You love without needing it returned. You give without needing to be thanked. This is not indifference. It is inner wealth. It is freedom. When peace matters more than socializing, there comes a point in one's life when the noise of the world begins to fade, not because the world has grown quieter, but because the soul has begun to listen inward. In our younger years, social connection is a kind of currency. We are taught to stay visible, stay connected, stay relevant. We accept invitations not always because we desire to go, but because we fear the silence that awaits if we don't. The clinking of glasses, the scattered laughter, the ongoing exchange of stories, they offer, for a while, the illusion of belonging. But in the wisdom years, those sacred decades beyond 60, we begin to question. What is the true cost of constant connection? And what are we sacrificing each time we choose noise over stillness? There is a heaviness that comes not from conflict, but from incongruence, from living in ways that no longer reflect who we are. Many of us continue social habits out of politeness or fear. We answer phone calls that drain us. We attend dinners where conversation skims the surface. We laugh when we do not feel joy. We show up, not because the moment is sacred, but because absence might be questioned. And yet, each time we do, something within us whispers, "You are no longer meant for this." This does not mean the people around us are unkind or unworthy. It means we are changing, and with that change comes the gentle but firm need to simplify. The Buddha taught, just as the ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, so too does the Dharma have one taste, the taste of liberation. And liberation, for many in old age, begins not with dramatic endings, but with small refusals. Consider the story of May, a woman in her late 60s. For decades, she was the center of every gathering, the planner, the hostess, the ever-smiling presence. Her life, as she once described it, was a full table with no empty chairs. But as the years passed, May found herself returning from these gatherings with a strange fatigue, not of body, but of spirit. She couldn't name it at first. But it came with a question she could no longer avoid. Why do I feel lonelier surrounded by people than I do in my own garden? One afternoon, after an especially noisy luncheon, May sat on her porch, a cup of jasmine tea in hand. The sun was sinking, casting golden light across her yard. In that moment, she felt more connected to the silence than she had to anything said at the table. That evening, she made a quiet decision. She would no longer say yes out of guilt. She would no longer perform friendliness when her soul longed for solitude. She would no longer confuse activity with aliveness. In the weeks that followed, May discovered that her peace was not hidden, it was simply overshadowed by the noise she had been too polite to silence. She began taking long walks without her phone. She wrote letters instead of attending events. She watched the moon rise without needing to share it on any screen. She was not isolating. She was returning. There is a misconception in the modern world that silence is the absence of something. But the awakened mind knows otherwise. Silence is not the absence of connection, it is the presence of depth. It is the room where your thoughts have space to breathe. It is the temple where the spirit begins to speak. It is the place where presence becomes palpable. When we fill every hour with socializing, we forget how to sit with ourselves. We forget the sound of our own breath, the wisdom of our own insight. And yet, the Buddha taught, if you are quiet enough, you will hear the flow of the universe. This hearing, this deep listening, is not available in crowded places. It arrives in the slow mornings, in the pages of an unread book, in the rustle of bamboos swaying gently in the wind. Letting go of social expectations requires courage. It means risking misunderstanding. It means choosing your well-being over your reputation. But it also means honoring your inner landscape as sacred, no longer offering it to conversations that do not see you, laughter that does not reach your eyes, or company that does not mirror your truth. When you say no to what depletes you, you are saying yes to the sanctuary within. And from that sanctuary, you begin to live not by social calendars, but by spiritual rhythm. The deeper truth is this: not everyone you spend time with is meant to walk with you forever. Some are there for a season, a lesson, a memory. But peace, deep, undisturbed peace, is your lifelong companion, if you allow it. So if today, you feel the quiet calling you, do not ignore it. If you long to spend your time differently, more inwardly, more meaningfully, trust that longing. It is not selfish. It is sacred. As the Zen saying goes, sitting quietly, doing nothing, spring comes and the grass grows by itself. Let spring come within you. Let friendships evolve. Let peace rise, not from the approval of others, but from the soft certainty that you are finally living in alignment with your soul. Fewer relationships, fewer expectations, fewer disappointments. As the years pass and the soul softens with time, many truths once hidden in the noise of youth begin to rise with quiet clarity. One such truth is this: not every relationship is meant to last, and not every connection is worth holding on to. When we are young, we often believe that having more people in our lives equals having more meaning, more joy, more strength. We fear solitude as though it were a failure, and we cling to relationships, even unfulfilling ones, because we confuse presence with peace. But in the sacred stillness of aging, we begin to realize that not all presence brings peace, and not all company soothes the heart. It is not uncommon to spend decades of our lives nurturing social bonds that, over time, quietly unravel. Sometimes the people we once shared laughter with become strangers we barely understand. Other times, the energy we give to keep a relationship alive no longer flows in both directions. We begin to feel the weight of one-sided effort, the exhausting role of being the one who always reaches out, always remembers, always tries. And slowly, disappointment settles in, not because others failed us intentionally, but because we carried unspoken expectations that could never be fulfilled. The Buddha taught that all suffering is born from attachment, and in friendships, attachment often disguises itself as loyalty. We remain in habitual connections not because they bring light, but because we fear what it would mean to let go. We equate fewer friends with failure. Yet, what if having fewer relationships was not a loss, but a refinement? What if, Instead of seeing solitude as emptiness, we recognized it as emotional clarity, the liberation from obligations that no longer align with who we are becoming. Consider an elder like William, a man who, for much of his life, believed that being surrounded by people meant he was loved. He made every effort to stay in touch, sent thoughtful messages, attended events even when he felt tired. But as he aged, he noticed how rarely those efforts were returned. Birthdays came and went without a call. Silence stretched where conversations once flowed. And then one day, sitting alone with a cup of tea, he felt a sadness not of being forgotten, but of finally admitting that he was the only one still trying. At that moment, William did not grow bitter, he grew wise. He realized that the energy he had spent holding on to everyone else had kept him from holding space for himself. From then on, William made peace with the impermanence of human bonds. He no longer saw fading friendships as personal failures, but as natural endings. Like autumn leaves falling from the branch, some relationships had simply served their season. And in their absence, he began to cultivate a deeper relationship with the one person he had ignored for far too long, himself. In the stillness that followed, something beautiful happened. His thoughts became clearer. His emotions steadier. His need for external approval dissolved like mist under the morning sun. He did not stop loving others, he simply stopped chasing them. And by doing so, he discovered a profound truth: when you release expectations, you also release the roots of disappointment. To have fewer relationships in old age is not a failure. It is the flowering of discernment. You no longer seek validation from numbers. You no longer perform to maintain bonds that drain you. Instead, you walk gently with those who truly see you, even if that is only one person. Even if that person is yourself. There is immense peace in this way of being. You stop waiting by the phone. You stop rehearsing conversations that never come. You stop explaining your worth. And in that quiet, you finally hear what the world has never been able to say: you are already whole. So when relationships begin to fall away in your later years, do not despair. Do not cling. Do not blame. Instead, bow in gratitude for the season they belong to, and the clarity they leave behind. Then turn inward, and trust that the greatest friendship you will ever have is not one that comes and goes, but the one that awakens when you are finally willing to sit in the company of your own undivided presence. When time becomes more precious than ever. Time, when we are young, seems infinite, a river flowing without end, a horizon that always stretches farther. We give it away freely, carelessly even, assuming there will always be more days to fix what is broken, more chances to pursue what we love, more energy to maintain the appearances of a full life. We fill our schedules with gatherings, errands, voices, noise, not because we always enjoy them, but because we believe we should. Because busyness feels like proof of purpose. But at 60, the texture of time begins to change. What once felt abundant now feels fleeting. Days pass more quickly. Mornings arrive with quieter urgency. The body speaks more honestly, and the soul begins to whisper questions it never dared ask in youth. What do I truly want to do with the rest of my life? Do I still need to be everywhere? Do I still need to say yes to everything? Or is it finally time to choose depth over distraction? The Buddha taught, the trouble is, you think you have time. These words are not meant to frighten, they are meant to awaken. Because in truth, time is not something we possess. It is something we are entrusted with. And the older we become, the more sacred that trust feels. Every morning we open our eyes is a blessing. Every evening we sit in quiet without pain or regret is a gift. To waste time now is not simply inefficient, It is ungrateful. There is a man I once knew, a retired professor named Min. In his earlier years, his calendar was filled edge to edge with appointments, classes, social events, and community duties. Even after retirement, he kept the rhythm going out of habit: dinners, meetings, favors, invitations. But at 72, after returning from yet another noisy banquet that left him feeling more drained than delighted, he asked himself a question: if I had only one more year to live, would I have spent the night this way? The question stunned him, not because of the answer, but because he realized how long it had gone unasked. From that moment forward, he began to choose differently. He no longer said yes to every invitation out of politeness. He no longer attended gatherings where small talk drowned the stillness of his heart. He began waking earlier, sitting quietly with a cup of tea while the world was still asleep. He took long walks in nature, not for exercise, but for presence. He returned to poetry, not to be published, but to feel again. He meditated daily, not to escape life, but to inhabit it more fully. Slowly, the life that once felt overfilled with motion began to feel spacious, intentional, and beautifully alive. Min discovered what many do too late, that it is not how much time we have, but how we live it that matters. Time well spent is not marked by how many people we meet, but by how deeply we meet ourselves. It is not defined by crowded schedules, but by quiet moments of being fully here, now. And so, in this sacred chapter of life, after 60, after the need to prove, after the need to perform, you are offered a choice. You can continue to be everywhere, or you can be truly somewhere. You can stretch yourself thin for appearances, or you can gather yourself inward for peace. You can count how many people invite you, or you can begin to cherish who you become when you're alone with your breath, your presence, your truth. Let your days be deliberate. Let your time be sacred. Let your moments be chosen, not consumed. And above all, let your life, what remains of it, not be a series of obligations, but a path of mindful return to what is essential, gentle, and quietly enough. True companionship comes from within. There is a kind of loneliness that is sharper than silence, the kind you feel in a crowded room, while smiling politely, nodding at stories you've heard 100 times before. It is the ache of not being seen, even when surrounded. It is the quiet realization that many of the people around you know your name, your habits, your face, but not your soul. And in that moment, the deepest truth begins to rise: the opposite of loneliness is not company, it is connection. We are conditioned to believe that to be alone is to be lacking something. We chase community, seek out invitations, and cling to relationships, not always because they nourish us, but often because we fear what the silence might reveal. But Buddhist wisdom invites a different view. It teaches us that solitude is not emptiness, it is intimacy with oneself. And in that intimacy, something rare and beautiful emerges: self-companionship, a relationship that no absence can take away. When you truly begin to befriend yourself, you discover a presence that is unshakable. You are no longer reliant on others to entertain you, validate you, or keep your mind occupied. You no longer fear a quiet evening, because the silence no longer feels like a void. Instead, it becomes a sacred space, where your thoughts have room to breathe, where your heart can speak without interruption, where you can simply be without needing to explain who you are to anyone. The Buddha taught, if you are quiet enough, you will hear the flow of the universe. You will feel its rhythm. Go with this flow. Happiness lies ahead. But how can we hear that rhythm if we are always filling the silence with other voices? How can we know ourselves, if we are constantly rushing to be known by others? True friendship, The kind that soothes your heart in the darkest hour, does not begin outside of you. It begins the moment you stop running from your own company. It begins when you sit down with your loneliness, not to escape it, but to understand it. It begins when you realize that the most loyal friend, the one who has been with you through every joy, every loss, every moment of silence, is the one in the mirror. Let others come and go. Let relationships bloom and fade. Let the world do what the world does. But do not abandon yourself. Make peace with your solitude. Make tea with your silence. And know, with gentle certainty, that you are never truly alone when you have made a home inside your own heart. Freedom does not arrive suddenly, nor does it come from acquiring more. It comes quietly, often unnoticed, in the precise moment we stop holding on. To let go is not to lose, but to release the illusion that we ever had control. It is to surrender our grasp on outcomes, on expectations, on the exhausting need to be everything to everyone. True letting go is not an act of rejection, it is an act of liberation. And the first thing we free is not the other person or the circumstance, but ourselves. There comes a time when the weight of should grows heavier than the joy of simply being. We should attend. We should answer. We should maintain. But each should is a thread that binds the heart to a script that was never ours. Slowly, gently, we begin to ask, what would happen if I no longer obeyed every expectation? What if I chose what felt true instead of what felt required? And in asking, we begin to loosen the knots that kept us from our own inner rhythm. Letting go is not passive. It is the most active form of inner clarity. It requires discernment, to see what no longer serves, to name it without anger, and to set it down without guilt. It is not a closing, but an opening, not a retreat, but a return. When we release the need to please, to explain, to be understood at all costs, we open space for something far more enduring, peace without performance. I once met an elderly man who had lived most of his life in the shadow of obligation. Every invitation was accepted, every friendship maintained, every tradition upheld, not because they brought him joy, but because he feared what others might think if he stopped. One evening, while sitting quietly on his porch, he felt a sudden stillness, not from the world, but from within. He realized he could stop now. Stop performing. Stop proving. Stop carrying what was never his. And he did. Not all at once, but gently, day by day, one thread at a time. What followed was not loneliness, but lightness. Not emptiness, but breath. The freedom he had longed for had always been available, it had only been hidden beneath layers of inherited duty and unspoken fear. When he finally let go, the world did not collapse. It softened. And in that softness, he found room to rest. This is the quiet truth many discover too late: we do not need to hold on to live fully. We only need to be present enough to notice what is already here. The grasping for approval, connection, control, is what closes the heart. The release is what allows it to open again. And so, letting go becomes the doorway, not the end. A threshold into a life no longer measured by others' opinions, but guided by the gentle compass of inner truth. It is the beginning of walking more slowly, of choosing more carefully, of speaking less but meaning more. It is where peace stops being an idea and becomes an experience. And from that space, nothing is forced, nothing is faked. We move not to meet expectations, but because the movement itself feels free. When you let go, you do not lose what matters. You lose what weighs you down. And in that release, you begin to rise, not above others, but above the noise. Above the fear. above the life you were told to live. You rise into simplicity, into honesty, into the soft, enduring truth, that freedom is not found outside of you, but within the quiet courage to finally stop holding on. And so, as we come to the end of this reflection, perhaps the question is no longer, do I need friends after 60, but rather, what kind of presence do I truly need in my life now? The Buddha never spoke against connection, he simply reminded us that clinging leads to suffering. Friendship is a beautiful part of life. But when it becomes an obligation, a performance, or a source of unrest, we are invited to let go, not out of resentment, but out of wisdom. In the later seasons of life, peace becomes more precious than praise. Stillness more valuable than small talk. And the relationship that matters most is the one you cultivate with your own heart. You don't need a room full of people to feel fulfilled. You don't need validation to prove your worth. You don't need to be surrounded to feel seen. Because when you've made peace with who you are, even silence becomes sacred company. If this message spoke to you, even quietly, I invite you to reflect in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your story, your truth. You never know who might find comfort in your words. And if you wish to walk this path of quiet wisdom with us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Here, we don't chase noise, we create space for clarity. Thank you for being here. May you be free from expectation. May you be rooted in presence. And may you remember always, the most faithful companion you will ever have is already within you. Until next time, be well, and walk gently.